Hello there, welcome back to Inquiring Minds. My name is Doug and I'm back with another Pen Resurrection Sunday video. This is a mid to late 1940s Waterman's Stalwart made in Canada at the Toronto Waterman Ideal Fountain Pen Factory. I picked this up at an antique shop while visiting Ontario a few weeks back. It was in pretty dingy shape but looked resurrectable, if that's a word. I don't think it is. But I've been able to get it back into working condition and it looks almost brand new. And I'll show you how I did it right now. Today's pen on the slab is this 1930s, 40s, I'm thinking 40s, Waterman Stalwart in this gray striated celluloid. I showed you this on my Antiques Roadshow 2 just a few weeks ago, and I've decided that I'm going to have at this pen and see whether I can get it shined up. I actually dipped the nib, which is an interesting oblique stub, and wrote with it a bit, and I thought, okay, I need to resurrect this pen completely because it is going to be a stunner, I think. So let's take a look at what needs to be done with this pen. As I say, it's a circa 1940s, I'm guessing, because there's no date codes on these. This one's made in Canada. It's a Waterman Stalwart. It has the two cap rings, which means it's a Stalwart, not a Starlet. And the cap has Waterman's made in Canada stamped into it, and the body has Waterman's made in Canada, fountain pen, and a bunch of snot. So we're going to try to get all that crap off of there, leave the imprints, polish up the hardware as much as it will polish. It looks like there's some brassing on here, and that clip needs to be straightened a little bit. But these clips were riveted in, so it's not, well, it is possible, but not possible for me to take that out of there and replace it. We're seeing a little bit of cracking in that celluloid right at the very top, but we're going to see how much we can polish this whole thing up and straighten that cap. We unscrew the cap and we see the nib. Let's get closer on this nib, and you can see, maybe you can see, I can't, and it says Waterman's Ideal 14 KT Canada 2A, and the 2A is the size of the nib, I'm thinking, because it looks like a number 2. And there is the ebonite feed, and the section does come off, and there were some remnants of old sack in there that just fell out the first time I opened this up. But other than that, I haven't done anything to it. So we're going to knock that feed out of there and that nib and polish it up. And let's take a look at the lever filler here. And you can see that lever is still working nicely. I'm suspecting that there's some more gunk down inside that pen, so we'll get that gunk out. I'm going to soak all these parts here in my ultrasonic bath for a few minutes, and that might actually get that snot off of there. And the ultrasonic bath is in pen flush, which is 9 parts distilled water and 1 part ammonia. So we'll do that and come back with my blue mat and start fixing this pen. And we're back fresh out of the bath, and we're going to see whether we can knock this block out. I'm going to knock your block off.
Edmund has been very cheeky. Shall I laugh at him, or chop his ugly head off?
Well, one hates to be harsh, ma'am, but I do think a bit of choppy is the only apt reaction.
Very well. Kill him!
And the way we do that is with Bill's block. Thank you, Bill, as always. So we're going to find the right slot for it. That looks like the right one right there. And find the right tap out bar. And that looks like the right one there. And it's just that simple, folks, when you have the right tools. Does he get those cool tools?
Does he get those wonderful toys?
And there's the nib and the feed. Still lots of ink left in there, but it's so much easier to knock these feeds out when you've soaked them for a while in some pen flush. And so we can polish that feed up, just the bit that's showing right there. It looks free of debris and ink. Looks pretty good. And the section looks pretty good. We can polish that up. Ebonite. And there's the nib and what it looks like before I start polishing it. Actually, a lot of that oxidation and tarnish came off of there in the pen flush, so it looks pretty good. So let's polish it up with some jeweler's cloth here. Give it a rub down or rub up, depending on which direction you're rubbing. Now to get the underside clean, I just fold the jewel cloth over and rub it with a cotton swab on the other side. And there we are. Isn't that amazing, folks? That's why gold is so precious. Years and years and years. Say this is 1941, maybe 42. That's 82 years this nib has been around. And it looks like it was made yesterday. Amazing. Maybe I'll rub myself with this jeweler cloth and see whether I can polish up to look like I did in the maybe in the 1980s. Now we'll see whether that polishing cloth will get some of that old tarnish off of these plated parts. Gold comes up really nicely, but plated, not so much. If the plating ends up being worn away, you get the brass showing through. So I'm wondering how much of that is tarnish and how much is just showing brass. We'll see. That's just after a few seconds. Not looking too bad. There's some real score marks in there and stuff that I'll never get out, but that's looking pretty good. And look at all the snots come off just in the pen flush. I know you want me to stop saying snot, but I think it's fun because that's just the kind of guy I am. So let's take a look at this clip and see what we can do with that, and also the cap bands. Now these cap bands are metal, of course, and this is celluloid. So celluloid over the years shrinks, and these bands don't. Metal doesn't shrink. Stop that. Metal doesn't shrink, but the celluloid does. And that's not turning, so that's good. Many of these cap bands will slip around in there, and you have to put a little tiny drop of CA glue on them or something to stabilize them. Let's give that a polish and see whether it comes up. And it's actually not coming up too badly. Now the real test is that clip. I'll go down here for a bit and we'll go into some fast motion and make it look like magic. So not too bad. Let's see what the end will look like after I go at it too. It looks pretty awful right now. Yeah, the gold is gone, but boy, that brass is polishing up nicely. The clip looks very nice now. I don't know that there's much we can do about straightening that clip. I'll try to get some pliers on there, bend it down just a bit to get it closer to the cap without breaking it. But now we have to go at this cap and barrel with some micro mesh. I'm going to start with 1500 grit and move all the way up to 12,000 grit. But there are some deeper scratches and gouges, like right there on the barrel and up here on the top of the cap. Whether you can see that or not, but they will require a little bit more grit. And that's where I bring in my flexible 400 grit sandpaper to get at those spots first. I sort of spot sand them to get those gouges out first, and then go at it with the rest of the micro mesh. So the more I started sanding, the more I started seeing more and more gouges. So I'm just going to go over the whole thing, except for that imprint right there with the 400 grit to get it down to a level scratch from gouge-free surface. There, I've pretty much gone over the entire surface of the barrel with 400 grit, and I got, I think, all of the gouges out. So the next pass with the 1200 grit micro mesh will tell me if some of those deeper gouges are still there. Yeah, not too bad. So I think I'll go through the micro meshes and then we'll do the same thing to the cap. So there's the barrel after some micro mesh and some polishing compound, my Meguiar's swirl remover number 2. Lots of elbow grease, and it looks fabulous. It's gray and black, but it's got definite blue hues to it. Deep, dark blue. Beautiful. So let's see it in contrast to the cap. There you go. That's the difference right there. And that imprint is still in place. So we'll go after the cap next. And here's the pen after some micromesh and some polishing compound. Cap and the barrel all cleaned up. Clip is all nice and shiny, even got the top rivet on that finial shined up. Imprint still intact, and there's the imprint on the cap as well. Not bad. So now I'm just going to polish up this section a little bit. There's nothing wrong with it, no scratches or anything. Just going to polish that up, and then we'll put the nib in the feed back in the section, and we'll dip test it and give it a writing sample, and then replace the sack. Okay, the section's all polished up. I'm just going to polish up the visible part of the ebonite feed. A little polishing compound, nice and shiny. And then I'm going to put these in the ultrasonic here just for a moment to get any residual polishing compound off them. Okay, so now I'm ready to put the nib and the feed back together with the section. And it goes just like that. And we should go right to the back of the section with that feed. Going to get some gripper material and give it a good push. And there we are, right at the end of that section. And that looks very, very nice. Waterman's Ideal 14 KT, Canada, 2A. Now we need to cut our sack to size. And the sack is going to end up being right there on the section. It's going to go over that bit right there to that line. And then the section goes into the barrel like that. So we're going to need the sack to be a little bit shorter than that. So let's measure that out and see where it comes to. Let's see, we might not have to cut it after all. I'll just use my sack spreader here and put it on temporarily. There we go. And yeah, it might need to be trimmed just a touch because it goes all the way to the bottom, but does it touch the bottom? Yeah, I might just trim off just a tiny bit to make sure that it doesn't go all the way to the bottom and crimp a little bit. So let's just take off a smidge. That's a technical term for about 4 millimeters. And we do the dry run again. Yeah, that seems to be about it. Yeah, so it's just shy of the bottom of that pen by about 4 or 5 millimeters. So now I can put my little inky nib shellac or pen to use. Take the top off, dial up a little bit of shellac. Really handy little tool this. And we're going to make sure we get shellac around there and nowhere near that little bit right there. That's where the ink has to flow. So I'm going to be very careful just to put that shellac around there and not on the end. And now we'll put it on the section for real. Just give it a small twist around like that to make sure it's straight. And I always like to put a bead of shellac just around the outside like that, just to seal it from any potential leaks. And let that dry overnight. So here we are the next day, and that's all dry. So I'm ready to put it into the barrel, but I wanted to tell you about the cap. While I was polishing the cap, the clip broke off. That's just riveted on the top of that cap, and that rivet was all corroded from contact with ink for over the years. That happens a lot to this model. Here is a barrel and body of another Stalwart without the clip that has no guts at all and has not been polished up. But this is a really nice blue color, so when we polish that up, it'll look great. But it's missing the clip, and inside here's the cap liner. And the way these caps are put together, the cap liner has a washer right there, like a metal disc that the rivet sits in. and then the rivet goes through there and through the clip, and they press it down, and that's how it's attached to the cap. You can see that rivet on the very top and is riveted through that cap liner at the bottom. So that broke off and the cap liner came out, and so what I did was I cleaned out the top of that cap liner, got all that old corroded metal out of there, and cleaned all the corrosion off the rivet as well. And while I had the clip free, I used my pliers on it to get it back into shape again, because it was bent outwards quite a bit. Then I took the cap liner and coated it with CA glue and put it back into the cap, pushed down on it, and let it sit like that until it dried. Then I took the cleaned up rivet and clip, put some CA glue on that, and pressed it down through by pressing back on the cap liner on the inside and then pressing down on the rivet. And then I clamped that overnight, so it dried completely. And that clip is now perfectly working order. So that was a bit of a happy accident that happened, because there's no way to straighten that clip other than take that clip off, and the rivet is a permanent installation. The only way to remove it other than breaking it is to drill through it and replace the rivet yourself. And I don't have those facilities at all. Now let's put the sack in the barrel. Now usually I use a little bit of talcum powder on the sack itself to let it slide. This is number 16 size sack, which is perfect for the Stalwart, and it's sliding very, very nicely in there. So I'm not going to use any talc on that. And I'm not going to shellac this section down either until I'm absolutely sure I'm not going to have to get into this pen. So I'm just going to push it down, and when I'm sure that this pen is ready to go, I'll put just a little dab of shellac on there just to stabilize that section and make it easier if you ever need to resack this pen again or get into it. So I'm just going to push that in there like that, and it's all lined up, and we're ready to ink up this pen. So we dip it in the ink up to the section, give it a push, we hear bubbles, let it go, wait for a second, do it a second time, more bubbles, let it go, and the third time's the charm. And when you let it go, you just wait for a couple of seconds for that sack to reinflate with ink. And wipe off our section and nib, and we're ready to write. And here we are with the Waterman Stalwart. They post very, very nicely. Becomes a nice length. It's a fairly slim pen. Let's check the girth of this pen here. It's almost 11 millimeters on the barrel, 9.4 on the top of the section, 7.9 at the narrowest part, and 8.6 at the flare. So this is a circa 1940s. I'd say it's 1945 to 50, something like that. Waterman's Stalwart. Is it having some flow issues? Yeah, it just has to get going. There we go. This is the first time I've written with it, so that's very nice. Let's see how wet it is. It's very wet, and it's extremely smooth. So it is a stub. Let's check out the measurements here. So it goes from about a 0.04 millimeter to 0.9 millimeters. So that's from about an extra fine to almost a double broad plus. And in terms of line variation by pressure, wow, there's a lot of flex to this. So I've got a feeling that this was not an oblique stub when it was born. I've got a real feeling that this is a regrind, that a tip is broken off or something and someone has made it into a stub. Let's do a quote. So it seems to be writing with some stops and starts. So I'm going to check on that nib. There's some reason why that feed is not supplying. It might be that that nib is not sitting flush down on top of that feed. So I'm going to check that out and see whether I can get it writing consistently. So I've gone back to the drawing board here. I heated the sack back off of that section and knocked the feed out. to get at that nib, and you can see how misaligned it is. Now I'm absolutely convinced this was a broken nib that someone made into a stub, because you can see that little bit of a wow right there. Maybe you can't, I'm not sure, but there's a little bit of a wow that sends that tine a slightly askew and doesn't line it up with the rest of that nib slot. And so I think we're getting some flow issues because of that little wow there. So I'm going to try to straighten that tine out with my nib block and see whether I can get this nib aligned a little bit better than that. So I've done my best to straighten this nib out using my block and my burnishing tool, and I think I've gotten it a little bit more aligned. And I've also done something else. I've extended that nib a little bit further out in the feed, a little bit further back. It was much closer to the tip before, and I'm hoping that that might give it a little bit more flow. Actually, might give it a little bit less. I'm not sure, but I'm trying everything at this point. So I'm just going to put this back in the barrel and dip test it and see whether it's improved. And you can see where this morning it was writing for a number of lines and then just ran out and then wouldn't start up again. It would get started for a bit and then run out. So let's see whether I've improved it or not. Nope, worse. Won't write at all now. Pen's too small to write with, unposted. Ow, bring my head into the camera here. I've got my eyes on. It's very, very smooth. The thing is whether the ink will continue to flow or not. Well, it's running. And we'll see how long it runs. It'll run out of ink. I'll have to dip it again. But now the question, whether it will continue to write like that when I put the sack back on. Well, we'll do that next. So I've only put the sack back on. I didn't shellac it down, so there may be some leaking here, but that's not the point. Unless there's an air leak, of course. Get some ink into that sack. And give this a try again. See how long it will write. It's amazingly smooth. Well, it's clear this is going to write and write and write. I'm not having any of the issues that I had earlier where it would write for a couple of lines and then just stop. I'm going to go ahead and shellac that sack down to that section and then repolish everything back up again and come back and talk about my final thoughts. Maybe they're my final thoughts about this fountain pen that's been dead and then alive and then dead again, and I wrote it off. And then I decided to do some surgery on it, and it's back alive again. So this was a very satisfying resurrection until the point the nib failed on me during the writing sample. But even when the clip broke on me, it was a happy accident because I could straighten it. There was no other way to straighten that clip other than to break it or drill it out. But now that the nib failed on me, I'm more positive than ever that this nib was broken before and someone fixed it, quote, fixed it, by cutting it off and making it into a stub. In fact, it looks like one of the nib resurrections I've done in the past. This is my 1945 Parker Vacuumatic Azure Blue Pearl. I was actually astonished when I wrote with this previously dead as a doornail nib, and now it's one of my very favorite writers. I did a nib bris or a nibectomy on this nib when the tine broke off and ground it into a stub, and it writes beautifully. So this Waterman is very close to that Parker. Smooth as glass and a lovely line variation like a small stub. But the nib wrote smoothly and beautifully for a few lines and then just stopped. I took the nib and feed out of the pen and burnished the nib on my nib blocks to straighten it. Out a bit. Then I reinstalled the nib and feed with the feed slightly further back than it was before. And now it's writing beautifully so far. I'm very pleased with how this celluloid has polished up as well. The color is understated but gorgeous. Stalwart also came in this brighter blue celluloid, which I considered swapping for the dark gray and gray blue striated celluloid, but this one has a subtle charm to it. I was going to put this pen up for sale for $80 US, but now that it has misbehaved, I'm going to keep my eye on it for a while before I'm confident it is writing without issues. Keep watching my Wix webpage where I offer pens for sale, as I might put this one up on the page. I have several other pens for sale there, and you can find the link to my Wix pen sale page in the description below. And there you have it. And thank you for watching. And that's all she wrote.
I made this.